Good afternoon to our guests in India, good evening to our friends from East Asia, and good morning to our guests from North America and Europe. Let me welcome you all to this Foreign Policy Conversations webinar on regional implications of recent developments in Afghanistan, what lies ahead for India and China. My name is Gautam and I'm currently in charge of the Iit Madras China Studies Center. For an update, we have participants today from 10 countries and we are currently oversubscribed for this event with close to 250 registrations. That probably gives you a sense of how much this subject is of topical relevance. To give you a context, recent US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the takeover by the Taliban in August this year presents a new collective challenge to the international community at large. These developments throw up many serious questions. How would India and China define their interests in the context of the vacuum that American exit from Afghanistan presents? Is there an argument to be made for a viable economic opportunity, given that the threat of instability and ethnic insurgency remains in Afghanistan, besides, of course, fears of an unfolding humanitarian crisis? What happens to India's development footprint in Afghanistan since 2001? So Iit Madras China Studies Center thought of bringing together this wonderful set of subject experts to deliberate on these complex developments. Some of the key talking points for today's webinar would include security implications for the region, China and its neighborhood policy, how the sequence of events affects the dynamics of interaction between India and China, and so on. To discuss all of these issues, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our eminent subject experts today. Ian Johnson is the Stephen Schwarzman Senior Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Ian was awarded the prestigious 2001 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting for his coverage of China for the Wall Street Journal. In 2017, Stanford University recognized him with the Shorenstein Journalism Award for his body of work covering Asia. Welcome, Ian. Next, we have Mr. Einar Tangen, Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute in Beijing. Mr. Tangen is also a leading political and economic commentator on China, across from CCTV to China Radio International to Xinhua, Al Jazeera, CNN News, and so on. He was previously Foreign Technology Advisor to Hebei Province and Heilongjiang Province in China, besides being on the advisory board of China Internet Information Center, or CIIC. Welcome, Mr. Tangen.
Thank you.
Next, we have Professor Hemant Adlakha, Professor of Chinese at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Professor Adlakha is also Vice Chairperson of the Institute of Chinese Studies, or ICS, in New Delhi. Welcome, Professor Adlakha. We are still waiting for Professor Jiadong to join us, but I would introduce him. He is Director of the Center for South Asian Studies in Fudan University in Shanghai, and he was formerly a visiting fellow with the Mershon Center for International Security Studies at The Ohio State University. And we are expecting him to join the webinar. He is confirmed over email, but I'm not exactly sure why he's not been able to make it until now. And our final speaker for the day would be Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya, Senior Visiting Fellow with the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. Ambassador Mukhopadhaya was India's ambassador to Syria between 2006 and 2008, to Afghanistan between 2010 and 2013, and to Myanmar between 2013 and 2016. He reopened the Indian Embassy in Kabul in November 2001 as Saudi Affairs after the ouster of the Taliban in Afghanistan in November 2001. For today's webinar, each of our speakers has 10 minutes. After all of our guests have spoken, we will have a brief Q&A session. Audience members could send in their questions during the webinar using the chat box. Please specify if your question is directed to a particular speaker, and we will do our best to include a proportional set of questions. Members of the audience are also reminded once again to please switch off your mics and video at all times to ensure best broadband receptivity and least interference with speaker presentations. So with these words of introduction, I request Ian to please take the floor with his remarks.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for organizing this interesting talk. I'll be giving a little bit of the view on how I see China's view of the recent situation, the recent developments in Afghanistan. You know, obviously, I don't need to go into this too much, but it's worth remembering that China and Central Asia, the subcontinent, have long ties. On the wall behind me, if you can see it, is a stone rubbing of Guanyin, painted by the Tang Dynasty artist Wu Daozi from the 8th century, which shows this profound and long-standing interaction with Central Asia, with China, and with Afghanistan, where, of course, Buddhism, one of the channels was through the Silk Road, which back then was quite different than it is as China imagines it today, but very lively and a two-way street that profoundly influenced China. I think historically, China had a lot of knowledge and understanding of Central Asia and of that, for example, in the Tang Dynasty, you had emperors who were probably from Central Asia. Some of the most famous poets were from there. And there was an orientation of China toward the West in the sense of Central Asia. And I think that this became lost over the past centuries, so that Central Asia was an area far off from China. It was still a focus in the last Chinese dynasty, the Qing, an area of conquest when they conquered the area of Xinjiang, which, as we know, means new territories. But that gives you an idea, a sense that this was an area that was relatively remote from the heartland of China, which is, of course, along the coast, and that China's obsession and concerns and interests were dealing with the foreigners who were attacking it, bringing also new ideas, who were mainly coming from the sea, and that China's strategy over the past decades, especially since the reform era starting in the late 19th centuries, has been one that's outwardly focused toward the seas in trade, commerce, industry, and in dealing with the West. So China inherited these enormous borders in the modern Chinese state. The People's Republic of China inherited these enormous borders that were bequeathed to it by the Qing dynasty. But there was, I would posit, relatively little savvy and understanding of that area. Border regions were seen primarily as troubled areas that had to be dealt with, and in many ways simply through Han immigration rather than through some sort of understanding of local peoples and integration of their culture into the broader Chinese community. After the West went into Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11, China, to a limited degree, went along too. It was one of the few real concrete areas of cooperation that people could point to when the United States, when successive administrations was pushing for China to become a stakeholder in the global community. China's interest, however, was mainly in preventing a recurrence of Al-Qaeda base camps. There were a handful of Uyghurs who were based there and being trained, and these people became known under the rubric of the East Turkestan independence movement, or ETIM. So China did not want to see a recurrence of this, and it went into Afghanistan and participated in the Western, ultimately failed effort at imposing some sort of a modern state and US image on Afghanistan. Overall, engagement was minimal. I think the West often wished that China would invest more to stabilize the new government. But China in foreign investment is often much more cautious, I think, than we give it credit for. It tends to be highly mercantilistic. It looks at profits and losses. There are strategic investments. There are investments that aren't going to yield money. But overall investments, including in the Belt and Road Initiative, are aimed at some point in turning a profit. Afghanistan did not fit this, and so Afghanistan was never part of BRI. So there was no super overarching strategic vision to go into Afghanistan, turn it into a client state or anything like that. After the collapse of the Western-supported government in Kabul over the summer, China has sort of had Afghanistan thrust upon it. Before the fall of the government, it had met, of course, with the Taliban, more so than, say, the Americans had. It had kept lines of communication, channels of communication open. But this was not, I don't believe, part of an extremely focused effort that would make Afghanistan a key part of Chinese foreign policy. It was simply keeping one's options open during a period of turmoil and transition. That's why I don't expect huge, massive trade deals or aid from China into Afghanistan. China doesn't do a lot of foreign aid, really. It tends to be more investment oriented. It has not until now invested in a big way in Afghanistan. Of course, people will talk about there are some mineral resources in Afghanistan. I could see some Chinese investment perhaps to help out the new government, but overall, I would be very surprised to see some sort of a huge Marshall Plan or anything like that to bolster the Taliban. I think the meetings in China, I think China's focus primarily is on its internal agenda. And for China, the main agenda right now is, again, more Pacific oriented, and that would be, of course, Taiwan. And in the run up to the next Party Congress, which will take place next autumn, I think in the run up to the next Party Congress, this focus is going to be still on that part of the world. Taiwan remains an overarching foreign policy priority. Domestic control, domestic stability. So Central Asia factors into this as much as it plays into that agenda in the sense of Xinjiang. Xinjiang, as we know, is an area of intense focus internationally of human rights abuses, how China is imposing some sort of control or renewed or stronger control over Xinjiang. This is often portrayed as an effort to control extremism. This group, ETIM, is again mentioned, even though I think most international terrorism experts would agree that ETIM, if it ever existed, has ceased to exist as an operational organization maybe 20 years ago. But this concern with extremism overrides China's interest in Xinjiang and by extension into Afghanistan. So again, I think the interest that China will have in Afghanistan is stability maintenance, preventing any recurrence of Al-Qaeda type or ETIM type base camps in Afghanistan. I would expect that the Taliban would go along with this because they are dependent on foreign aid, and what little aid and investment China can send would be, I'm sure, contingent on these groups not coming back into Afghanistan. So I think that will probably be the main Chinese focus and interest. You know, I think also one shouldn't underestimate, there is some public opinion in China that people sometimes underestimate. They tend to think of China as a purely authoritarian state where the government can do whatever it wants. But things like the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, have taken flack domestically for being too generous. Why are we spending money? Why are we investing in these other parts of the world when there are domestic needs? Obviously, it's not as pronounced as other parts of the, say, the populism in the United States, America first. So there's not really sort of a China first movement in China. But I don't think that there's a huge interest among Chinese leaders to move into Afghanistan and spend a huge amount of money. They don't, you know, China already has poor neighboring client states such as North Korea. I don't think it wants to add another state such as Afghanistan that it has to support. So I think it would try to stabilize things, prevent things from getting worse. So the main focus will be whatever investments there are, I think will primarily be driven by mercantilistic interests and a security focus. China will not care about the Taliban's human rights abuses. It will not care about the status of women. It never does. China has this mantra of never interfering in the internal affairs of other countries, especially when those countries are allied with it. And so I think that they will not really get too involved. Of course, this will appear strange. On the one hand, cracking down on alleged Islamists in Xinjiang. On the other hand, striking some sort of a deal with an Islamist government in Afghanistan. But I think the main interest China has is to avoid some sort of upheaval, to avoid instability. And so I think those will be the overarching factors driving China's engagement with Afghanistan in the coming years. And with that, I'll stop my comments and turn it over to the next. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I would now request Mr. Einar Tangen to offer your remarks.
Well, I want to thank Ian. I'm going to disagree with him on a number of issues. Regional stability is a key issue for China, and that's what the Belt and Road has been about. That's what RCEP and all these different trade negotiations, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, etc. So I would not say that everything is just focused on Taiwan. China sees threats in 5 different areas: Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and also in the South China Seas. And this is just another threat on it. So let's put this in perspective. What we have here is the United States, after 20 years, broke Afghanistan, and they've left it bankrupt, and they put it on the doorstep of entities that they don't particularly like: Pakistan, Iran, Russia, China. And this has created kind of a regional issue. I think the calculus in Washington was that by leaving this kind of problem on the doorstep of these countries that the U.S. views antagonistically, that they could, divert resources to that, make sure that these countries were preoccupied with trying to deal with this. But in many ways, this is a very short-term situation because there's an existential threat that has come along with it. The evacuation, disastrous, mishandled by the U.S., left allies and the Afghan government in a terrible situation. It soon fell against any kind of supposed intelligence that was given to them by the world's most well-funded intelligence agencies. And it has resulted in people wondering about the reliability of the United States. And this is an existential issue, not just about Afghanistan, for the entire world. Remember, what the United States and China share in common is that they're at near the apex of the existing international order. They benefit from an international order where there is trade. But you wouldn't know that given what's been happening in the United States, first especially under Donald Trump, who was attacking friend and foe with equal vigor, it seemed. And also with Joe Biden, who seems to have just kind of defaulted to whatever Trump had in place as he goes forward. So let's talk a little bit about security. Initially, it sounds fine to leave this, bag of terrible things on everyone's doorsteps and make sure that they have to take it. But terrorism, as we have found out, and we knew in 9/11, is not confined to a particular region. It reaches out and attacks whatever it sees as a target of opportunity. So at this juncture, this idea that somehow the US can kind of sit back and allow these other countries to deal with this terrorist threat doesn't seem credible given what we have seen in the past. So it is incumbent not only on these countries, but also the US, if they see any kind of long-term situation here, to start thinking about how they can control this. But you can't do that if you leave the country and you have 80,000 people who for 20 years have been basically living in caves and fighting guerrilla style against you, and you take away their money. and they don't have the ability to do it. Remember, this is a nation of 38 million, 3 million worked in the government. Of the fighters, 80,000, they're not even all together. You have 4 very distinct factions within the Taliban itself. You have outside threats who are attacking it, ISIL-K. And it's in a very, very precarious position. They're facing humanitarian crisis. People are going to starve and die. There is violence in the streets. This is not a place where there could be a civil war if things get desperate enough. The U.S. is sitting back and thinking that we'll just provide humanitarian aid and pretend to care about the people there that we left behind. Meanwhile, we will keep the $10 billion that are there, and we will keep it away from the Taliban because, quote, they're our enemy and they defeated us. Well, it doesn't all add up. When you react emotionally to a situation like that, you're forgetting what the long-term consequences are going to be. If you want to turn Afghanistan into a failed state where terrorism can operate and use it as a base, this is exactly what you would be doing. Now, let's turn our attention to China and India. Obviously, China and India have very, very difficult low point in relations, probably the lowest point since 1962. There have been a number of altercations, not overwhelmingly serious, but lives have been lost. And it's over, supposedly over valleys that no one could live in, so cold in the wintertime, they can barely muster troops to be there. But the reality is that there's a geopolitical angle to this. China's success and its economic footprint as it continues to widen interferes or walks into areas of traditional spheres of influence that India has traditionally had. And this is in fact threatening. China's success in itself is an existential threat to India's belief in its own democracy and system of government and things like that. Because if you do in fact have the best system of government, then in theory you should be doing better. And if somebody else has a very bad system of government, they should be doing poorly. But over the last 40 years, there's been a juxtaposition in where things are. India started out ahead, and now it's way behind. China started behind, and now it's way ahead. So there is this kind of existential issue about how you deal with this, and I think that adds an emotional element to this geopolitical kind of situation. In terms of China, China is, they believe that everything can be solved by trade. And that's not necessarily true. I don't think they completely understand the role of religion or the power and impact that it can have. They can see it, but they really just believe that if you give people enough prosperity, that you would be able to get them to adhere to some sort of doctrine where you do what you want, we do what we want, but we keep it peaceful. That hasn't happened. So what will happen going forward? I don't believe that India is going to sit by while Pakistan exerts more influence over Afghanistan. They see that as anathema, as possible potential for trouble, especially in Jammu and Kashmir, where a victorious, energized Muslim, radical Muslim movement could try to excite local people into some sort of uprising. There are also other components, but within Afghanistan right now, it is so difficult to separate. You pull on one thread, it just simply knots together with other ones. You have tribal conflicts in addition to the 4 factions that you have inside the government. You have 8 very dangerous terrorist groups that are operating within Afghanistan. Obviously, they think that they were helpful to the Taliban in overthrowing the U.S., and the Taliban feels that they have some sort of alignment to them. This idea, though, that EITM, this is the East Islamic Turkic movement, that is aimed at freeing, or they say, the independence of the Uyghur region. They do exist. I think the people who died in the explosion at the airport can attest to that. The ISIK, who claimed responsibility, made it very clear that this was a Uyghur and that this was about trying to recruit Uyghurs to their side. There are about 750 hardened fighters who were stationed near the border during the time prior to the U.S. being basically leaving. And the Chinese are very anxious to know exactly where they are. The intelligence says that they have been moved somewhere else in Afghanistan, but China is not comfortable until they know exactly where they are, that they've been removed. China will continue to look for some method of ensuring its safety. They'll use the SCO, that's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or any means necessary, including giving money, in order to kind of stabilize the situation. So with that, I will end my talk.
Thank you, Mr. Tangen. I now request Professor Adlakha to offer his remarks.
Thank you, Joe. Let me also thank China Studies Center, Iit Madras, for bringing this very interesting panel together. I'm very happy to be part of it. Now, since I have a limited 10 minutes time, like my co-speakers, co-panelists, let me quickly come to my topic. But before I do that, I must also mention what I found interesting in my previous two speakers' presentations. Of course, I thank them for putting on table various points which I need not repeat or look into. But at the same time, I noticed two very interesting things in their presentation. Whereas Ian Johnson talked about China and Central Asia, historical background, and China and Afghanistan, he did not really talk much about America or ISK, for example. And in Mr. Einar Tangen, he talked about America a lot and not as much about China, but of course he did talk about India also. I remember, if I'm not wrong, he did say that India is not going to sit by in the situation in Afghanistan. So with these two interesting observations, and my thanks to my previous speakers to make my task easy, I'll quickly present before you 5 short points which I noted down in order to fit into my 10 minutes. I'll quickly read them out. My first point is that we need to know the context in which we are talking about what is happening in Afghanistan today and its implications for India and China, as the topic of the day suggests. Now, what the context, international context, is the continuation of the Cold War between the US and China. And this is the continuation of the Cold War, which began with the Obama presidency. The fag end of the first term of President Obama, when he launched or introduced the pivot to Asia. And Obama wanted to end the US war in Iraq in order to focus on Afghanistan. President Biden has done the same by withdrawing the US troops in Afghanistan in order to carry out a similar military pivot toward China. Why? That is to move away from and focus on spending money or military expenditure on kind of weapons which are more suitable to the Pacific theater. That is one of the reasons. Now, my second point is that contrary to the general belief, especially in the West and America included, that it would be a gross misreading of the situation if we look at what happened in Afghanistan on or around 15th August, just as a zero-sum game between America's loss and China's gain. Why do I say that? Because, of course, it is a huge advantage for China that the situation on its western borders, at least for now, promises to be relatively stable with no direct US military presence. But at the same time, it is not going to be any less challenging for Beijing to keep the Taliban in Kabul in good humor and to be able to sustain a good relationship with the new Afghanistan ruled by the Taliban. My third point is that China has its task cut out in the new situation in Afghanistan. By that, I mean, one, irrespective of a series of top-level meetings between China and the Taliban in recent times, and notwithstanding the Taliban repeated assurance to Beijing over militancy or terrorist strikes in Xinjiang, Beijing is aware that China is not and cannot be the sole alternative to the United States for the new Taliban government in Afghanistan. And second, despite enduring and positive ties Beijing enjoys with Islamabad and Tehran and Moscow too, a big challenge for Beijing is going to be to keep the US proxy presence in Afghanistan under check on the one hand, and on the other hand, avoid falling out with Pakistan and Iran over specific geopolitical and national interest and their respective influences in Afghanistan. Therefore, what China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi said in the immediate aftermath of Taliban's taking control in Kabul and in Afghanistan, and I quote him, Mr. Wang Yi had said that China desires a soft landing for Afghanistan. My fourth point is that this is also China's opportunity to win the great game in Eurasia. China is hoping the Taliban victory will result in Washington being forced to exit Central Asia, which in turn will see Beijing consolidating its hold in the region, eventually and ultimately making it possible for China to establish its geopolitical control and domination in the vast Eurasian region, which is home to 70% of the world's population and productivity. My last and final point is India made inconsequential. Most Chinese commentators have pointed out three factors why it is in China's interest to make India inconsequential in the Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. First, to crush India's ambitions in unpredictable post-15th August Afghanistan, China must make full use of the opportunity to oust the Indian presence in Afghanistan, with the help of Pakistan, of course. Second, marginalizing India in Afghanistan would mean that China need not any longer bother about the Indian opposition to the BRI, especially in the context of CPEC, and that China will be able to smoothly carry out its efforts to expand financing and building infrastructure across the region, which in turn will extend the BRI access to markets in the Middle East. Finally, let me end with why Beijing reckons that the US troop withdrawal will jeopardize India's ambitions and national interest in the region. India's past strategy in Afghanistan has pushed itself into embarrassment, and India now can't make a U-turn from that. That is one point. Nor can it cast aside the geopolitical influence of the US and its Western allies. So, as I quote here a well-known Chinese scholar associated with a think tank in Beijing, who commented, and I quote, that a pro-Beijing Taliban-ruled Afghan government is not only a major foreign policy setback, but it is a blow to India's national security concerns. Thank you. I think I'll stop there.
Many thanks, Professor Adlakha. We are also very happy that Professor Zhang, Director of the Center of South Asian Studies in Fudan University, has been able to join us. There were some technical glitches which disallowed him from joining the meeting earlier. Welcome, Professor Zhang, and the floor is all yours. Your mic is muted. You may want to unmute yourself and then offer your remarks to the audience.
Thank you for your invitation. I'm really very sorry because it's my first time to use this app for conference. I don't know how to handle it. Thank you, Professor Chen Jianying. She helped me to finish this process. So my topic is mainly about. I think I missed lots of other speakers. My topic is mainly about Afghanistan itself and China's consideration, China's viewpoints over Afghanistan. The first part is about Afghanistan. And as everyone knows, international society, I think we are seeing this new government, the Taliban government is coming. I think it needs lots of time for us to make a final decision, to make a final conclusion. What kind of government, what kind of country Afghanistan and the Taliban will have. It's not the time for us to say anything decisively. So Afghanistan, I think, even US retreated from there. Afghanistan have some opportunities, I think. The first opportunity is, Taliban's today, this Taliban's international environment is much better, than the past. And it is possible for Taliban to gain recognition from more countries. The first time Taliban just gets 3 countries recognition, but this time maybe more, maybe. The second opportunity for Taliban is Afghanistan's economic foundation today is much better than 20 years ago. But today, Afghanistan's transportation system and other infrastructure system, I think, are much better than the past. The GDP in total and the per capita value are also much higher than in 2001. The third opportunity for Afghanistan is Afghanistan education, medical and health system and standard in Afghanistan is much better than 20 years ago. So we see a population boom from 2001 to this year. Afghan population increased from 21 million to almost 40 million. It means Afghanistan's past 20 years is much good, is much better than the past. The fourth opportunity for Taliban is Afghan people today. Sorry, it's not for Taliban. It's an opportunity for Afghanistan. Today's Afghan people has a much stronger sense of modernity or modernization. A large number of women have received basic education. Even lots of reports say Taliban tried to overthrow some women education system, but these educated women already there. So I think this is unprecedented in the history of Afghanistan. Of course, Afghanistan also faces lots of challenges. The first challenge is Afghan politics is more diverse. 20 years ago, Afghan politics is very simple, is Taliban and anti-Taliban bloc. But today different. Today, even Taliban itself is become a diverse organization. Not like 20 years ago. 20 years ago, Taliban is small, is weak, but it's a very intense organization. But today, Taliban is big, a network, very big network, but its center, power center, is weak. Its structure is loose. And within country, we can see Taliban, anti-Taliban, and a lot of other organizations, including Islamic State organization, this kind. So today's Afghan politics is very hard to make any prediction, and everything is possible, I think. The second challenge for Taliban and Afghanistan is today Afghan people's expectation for life from lot of issues are much higher than 20 years ago. So it should be very big challenge for Taliban governments, how to manage it, how to meet this very huge demand. So it's very, very different. Because 20 years ago, Taliban finished the war, but today is not. Today is different. Today, Afghan people, lots of people, they have experience with a relatively high life standard. If Taliban can't meet this demand, I think lots of people's attitude towards Taliban will be changed much. The third challenge for Taliban is the Taliban will face an economic dilemma. Afghan economy will not be able to support a strong government, because a strong government means you need a strong economic foundation. But Afghan economy is weak. And in the past, the US and the US alliance providing lots of money to former governments, but not to these Taliban governments. So it's some problem. A weak government can't assume function of guiding Afghanistan. So it's a dilemma. The fourth challenge for Taliban is Taliban will face an ideological dilemma. If Taliban does not adhere to radical ideology, to the past ideology, Taliban were not able to consolidate their foundations, will not compete with other radical forces, such as Islamic State organization. But if they adhere to the past ideology, Taliban will not be widely recognized by international society. So without international society's recognition, Taliban will not have a chance to develop the economy well. So it is a very hard issue, I think, for Taliban governments. The fifth point for Taliban is Taliban also face a very brave security challenge. Just a few days ago, a Taliban leader was killed in a terrorist attack. So when Taliban transformed itself from a rebellion group to a ruling party, it's not very easy. And the Taliban's adversaries will use the similar terrorist tactics that the Taliban once used. They use these tactics against the Taliban itself, including terrorist attacks. So it's not very easy. Afghanistan has a chance. It also faces lots of challenges. In the short term, economy is everything. And the winter is coming. If Taliban can't handle economic challenge, can't get international supports, strong supports, and this winter would be very bitter for Taliban, for Afghan people. In the long term, I think, is how to transform Afghanistan from a traditional society to a modern society. And Afghan society is diverse, and some parts is still, I think, maybe is not belong to modern world. It belong to another world. So it's not very easy. The second part for my presentation is about China's policy towards Afghanistan. Firstly, I want to share my point about China's main considerations on the issue of Afghanistan. Afghanistan, just personally, maybe including lots of my Chinese colleagues do not support my idea. Personally, I think Afghanistan is not important to China. in geopolitics, in geoeconomics, because China's geographical location is very different from other world powers. It's different from Russia, Soviet Union. It's different from UK Empire. It's also different from the United States, because China is in the east part of Asia. Not any necessary for China to any important parts of this world must travel through Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a bridge, is a channel between Central Asia and South Asia. It's not a channel between East Asia and West Asia. So you can see it's every China's important international travel routes. Not anyone must via Afghanistan. So I think some people maybe very like to overestimate China's strategic goal over Afghan issue. I don't think it's true. China's consideration on Afghanistan is many have this several points. The first is about terrorism issue. It's about religious radical religious issue. You know, when the Taliban first time to come to power, Afghanistan used to be a hotbed.
Professor Zhang, you have 1 more minute, so I'm
sorry. Just a quick point. Okay, China's first consideration is about terrorism issue and radical religious issue. The second consideration is about drug issue and drug illegal trafficking. The third consideration is about a possible refugee issue. The fourth point is about U.S.-Pakistan relationship. I think is also very important. So China's possible policy and measures. The first, China will hold a neighborhood organization plus international sovereignty. Without other neighbors' support, China will do anything singly. And the second point is humanitarian aid first, plus wait and see. So you can see China like to provide some goods, some humanitarian assistance, but no more others. So thank you very much. I'll finish here. Chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang. I would now request our final speaker for the day, Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya, to take the floor.
Thank you, Professor Thomas, for giving me the floor, and I'd like to thank my very distinguished panelists for their very interesting presentations. A lot that I could agree with, a few points of difference. So let me actually start with one of them. I think most speakers have talked about the sort of lack of strategic importance of Afghanistan for China and the many aspects of caution in China's Afghanistan relationship relating to terrorism and other factors. But I'd also just maybe to be a little different, actually give some reasons why China might be tempted or might be thinking of Afghanistan a little more strategically. Firstly, I think China senses a moment of opportunity with the US withdrawal from possibly one of its weakest underbellies in the Xinjiang region. And in addition to that, I think China has global interests and it's expanding global interests. So one of those interests would certainly be that it would be tempting for China to cross the Central Asian mountains, and a lot of what China has been doing can be interpreted in that sense, and actually reach out towards Iran, where it has a 400 billion 25-year geo-economic deal with some strategic overtones. Secondly, if it did that, China would also become a much more major player in the Persian Gulf and the Arab world, just as the US actually seems to be diverting its interest, actually leaving that region to its allies that include Israel and now some of the Gulf countries and Emirates and so on, and move towards the Indo-Pacific. The third reason in which it could be very interesting for China is that in many ways China faces pressure from the United States, now the AUKUS and the Quad in general in the Indo-Pacific, and going through the continental Central Asia to the Gulf, to its one of its primary energy sources, could be a way and an outlet from the pressure from the Indo-Pacific towards through the Central Asian region into the Gulf areas. And fourth, I think it has a partnership with Pakistan. Pakistan would like to deny Afghanistan access to India. It has never really cooperated with the Afghanistan-Pakistan Transit Trade Agreement, allowing surface two-way transit trade with India. And in fact, China's sort of game plan, and it's using geoeconomics in that, is to actually turn Afghanistan around towards Central Asia. And Pakistan actually hopes that China would be its geo-economic partner in using its strategic heft, its economic muscle, and if necessary, which I think is very unlikely, its military might, in being able to stabilize and turn Afghanistan towards Central Asia. So there are, and this would be in China's interests as well. So there are several good strategic and geopolitical reasons why China could actually be interested in this. Having said that, I think it's absolutely true what others have said, that China's interests have been basically security oriented. And it has been very wary in terms of its investments. Even the investments that it has made are rather minimal. And it will be possibly very cautious in doing that. But at the same time, particularly seeing the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party now and its global ambitions, I think the temptation to enter into Afghanistan, or at least use Afghanistan as a bridge towards the Gulf, will be very strong. And possibly, as Professor Zhang said, it's the early days. I think time will tell whether what happens. I think Chinese priorities are possibly lie, its real strategic priorities lie elsewhere. And what we may see is a little bit of a tussle. But if China thinks that it can address the problem of stability in Afghanistan only by dealing with the ATIM, it will be making a big mistake, because in reality, the ATIM may or may not be a small group, but it is allied with at least a dozen other extremist, radical, and in some cases terrorist groups, who are all under the umbrella in one way or the other of the Pakistani ISI as well as the Taliban. Remember, the Taliban have been fighting this war first earlier in the 90s, and now since 2001, with the support of a number of other radical outfits with sectarian or regional agendas, whether it's in Central Asia, or it is in Chechnya, or it is in India, or it is in Kashmir, or for that matter, even against the Shias. And we are seeing the kind of number of attacks against Shias increasing with the ISK. Secondly, I think the point that I would like to make is, in the last few years, there's been a lot of kind of whitewashing of the Taliban as somehow, in the end, a changed or a reformed Taliban, a Taliban much more interested in international recognition, also interested in investment and development. But my experience of the Taliban, and I saw it immediately after the Taliban 1.0, is that Taliban actually has very little interest in the economy. Its almost entire interest is in establishing, Shariat rule according to their philosophy. In 2001, Afghanistan had inherited both the destruction of the Mujahideen period, as well as the non-development and the non-relationship with the international community. And there was no development absolutely done. There was not even the reconstruction of Kabul, which had been destroyed by the intra-Mujahideen fighting during that period. And I think the language that it is using of investment and development is actually possibly a language that is being prompted from its mentors in Pakistan. But the reality is that the situation that the Taliban will face and Afghanistan will face now will be very, very non-conducive to any kind of Chinese strategic interests. Firstly, we have the problem of the Taliban and the Islamic Republic. Though the Islamic Republic is now down and out, I think there's no doubt that there is going to be resistance to them. It will come up in gradual, it's right now in a state of shock, but as the Taliban consolidate their rule, and if their rule gets repressive, and if it is non-inclusive, there is going to be opposition to it. There is already the kind of flag uprisings, the women uprisings. You saw resistance in Panjshir. Much more is going to happen in other parts of the country. And if the Taliban do face a very severe economic winter, as we talk about humanitarian crisis, these are only going to multiply. But that's not the only kind of instability that Taliban will face. Taliban has internal rivalries, internal factions that could erupt and become almost as bad as the intra-Mujahideen fighting of the 90s. There could be differences between elements and factions of the Taliban and the ISI and Pakistan. Some of that friction is already beginning to arise as intra-Taliban rivalries surface. There is going to be what has already been described as the contest between the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and the ISK, in which case, if the Taliban does not keep up with the radical trends amongst the ISK, they are likely to lose followers who might switch over to the ISK. Even the resistance movement itself could take a national form, or it could take an internal form and an ethnic form. There could be a Pashtun, non-Pashtun conflict, and there could be a north-south kind of opposition. If the Taliban, who are largely a Pashtun force, actually start uniting on both sides of the border, there could be a serious problem for Pakistan. Pakistan already has a problem with the TTP. So there's a multitude of such conflicts, and I'm not even including the role of external powers, and I'm not even including the role of the 10-odd extremist outfits that are active under the umbrella of the Taliban, who the Taliban can never be able to act against because they have been fighting in the trenches for the last 20 years. They are virtually blood brothers. So this is the situation that we have. Now, actually, I would say that there is one point of convergence. There are many points of divergence between India and China, but there is one point of convergence between China and India, and actually divergences between China and Pakistan and China and the United States. Some speakers have talked about US interest in destabilizing the region so that its strategic rivals, whether it's China, Russia, or Iran, are kept on their toes. This is one point that is going to be there, but China is going to want stability. If it wants to pursue any of its strategic ambitions or its economic ambitions, it's going to want stability. And that stability is contrary to Pakistani interests, because Pakistan, in order to externalize its Pashtun problem, in order to use Afghanistan for strategic depth against India and also for strategic outreach towards Central Asia, will have to keep radicalism fomenting. So this could be a point of divergence and difference between China and Pakistan in future. Whereas China and India do have an interest in looking at Afghanistan as a kind of bridge between various parts of South Asia, East Asia, and West Asia. They have an interest in developing the mineral sector and possibly also the livelihood sector in Afghanistan. And they certainly have a big interest in ensuring that extremism does not succeed, and rather that a kind of moderate version of Islam does succeed. I think China is also progressivist in terms of the kind of modern Afghanistan it would like to see. Now, of course, this will mean that China and India will have to sort of separate their interests and antipathies relating to Afghanistan. It means that China will have to work with India in terms of stabilizing Afghanistan, using India as its largest traditional market, a natural market for Afghan products. But it really depends on the leadership of the two countries if they are able to look beyond the immediate sort of differences and geopolitical rivalries and look at the strategic convergences on stability and stabilizing Afghanistan in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, and I'd like to thank all of our speakers for laying out this fantastic spectrum of opinion on this very complex issue. I have a range of questions which I have gathered from the chat box. So there are some which are specifically addressed to the speaker, and there are some which could be taken by you. I leave it to the speakers to take a call on which question they'd like to answer. But I'd like to begin with this question from Amit Kumar, and this is directed to Einar Tangen. His question is that, isn't China trapped in defining the word terrorism when on the one hand it calls the acts of ETIM as acts of terrorism, but on the other hand, it is showing some kind of openness in supporting the Taliban government? For in its interest of preserving peace and stability, it is willing to sort of extend that benefit of doubt to the Taliban government. I mean, that's what Amit is trying to say. Some Taliban ministers are UN-listed terrorists, and Taliban is also a centrifugal force for other organizations like Al-Qaeda and so on. So this is the first question, which is directed to Einar Tangen. Should I lay out the questions first, and then the speakers may want to sort of gather their thoughts in the meantime and then respond? Would that be okay? Would that be preferable?
I would prefer to just answer the questions as they come, if that's
All right.
okay.
All right, please go ahead.
So I mean, all countries, I mean, you have to separate different issues amongst them. I mean, a terrorist is a terrorist by the definition of what they do. In this particular case, the Taliban think of themselves as freedom fighters who have rid their land of first the Soviets and then the United States. They are in control. So you're, what can you do? You either deal with them, or you invade them, or try to fight them. Well, trying to use bullets and bombs to enforce your values on other countries has not worked so far. I don't think that the Chinese are interested in that kind of situation. But trying to say that there is things. The world is complex. China is not cheering on the sideline for the Taliban. They saw this as a complex war that was not going anywhere, but that it was started by the U.S. The issue here was that the U.S. wanted to go in there and get revenge. They were in there 1 month after 9/11, the terrorist attack. And then they switched their idea to nation building. It didn't work. They left. They left the situation in China's lap. In this particular case, you have to do the best you can. India will face the same issue. Do you deal with the Taliban, or do you just watch things implode? I would agree with what the ambassador said. China is very interested in regional stability, peace, and this is what they are going to pursue. It's not about putting their values or making judgments about groups that they do not have a wonderful opinion of. It's simply dealing with the realities.
Thank you, Mr. Tangen. The next question, I'd ask Ian to have a go at this. And the question is, Ian, your presentation was mostly about China's indifference to Afghanistan that you foresee. And so I think this question is directed to you. The question is, can we expect in the near future, given the chaos in Afghanistan and the security threat that it poses to the region continuously, can we expect that India, China, and the United States make some kind of an effort to make Afghanistan a stable nation state for their long-term interests? Or is Afghanistan condemned to be a victim of superpower geopolitics as it is happening currently?
That would be, yes, no, that would be a good outcome if regional countries could support Afghanistan in finding its own way and in building a stable country. Right now, I don't know how, I don't know the position that China, I don't know if China can pursue that kind of path that would require more diplomatic engagement than it's shown. It's already in a tense situation with India. I don't know if it would be able to find common ground or not. And in Pakistan, I think the relationship between Pakistan and China is very complex as it is with between Pakistan and the United States. So yeah, they do want Afghanistan to be stable. Primarily, they just want to negate it as a source of instability. I don't think they're that interested in turning it into a mini China or something like that. But they will try to pursue some sort of policy there. But my gut feeling is, just given the way China's interest in that area, its competencies in the foreign ministry and so on, that it will probably not go there in a big way and make a big push toward that. But you're wrong.
Thank you, Ian. The next question is directed to Professor Adlakha, who I remember had mentioned that China is in some ways now able to see its economic goals coming to fruition without worrying much about India. So the question here from the audience is that India's investment in Afghanistan were mostly in the form of humanitarian aid that helps build up schools, hospitals, dams, etc. So how can this strategy over the years, this strategy of diplomacy, be considered as a failure when India had managed to create a positive view in the minds of normal Afghan people? And so an associated question is, how can India translate those cultural ties and massive goodwill towards India to forge some kind of a deal with the Taliban government? And I see this question equally relevant for Ambassador Mukhopadhaya also. So you may want to also chip in with your input.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for the questions. Let me clarify the context in which I had said what I had said about why China is very focused on making India's presence or Indian role in Afghanistan in the new situation as inconsequential. And I'm saying it on the basis of the large number of commentaries which I've seen in the Chinese media by experts and scholars. And I think the central point which is running through all these commentaries or most of these commentaries is that India has been very actively engaged in destabilizing Chinese presence, especially in CPEC area, and also the India's involvement in various activities which can be called local terrorist activities, and Chinese articles have openly actually mentioned India's name behind them. So that is what the overriding concern of the Chinese commentator has been, that if China has to have peaceful presence and replicate the CPEC-like presence in Afghanistan, then first thing is to reduce or to bring down to zero the Indian presence in whatever form it is in Afghanistan. So that was the context in which I had mentioned this thing. I think that clarifies, or that is my answer to the question.
Yeah. Okay. May I say something?
Yes, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, especially the second part, how India can translate the accumulated cultural ties and massive.
Right. So I think firstly, let me clarify that India's economic investments in Afghanistan were not really seen in terms of economic returns. They were seen more in terms of emotional returns and political capital, political goodwill. And I think it's not just humanitarian assistance that we provided, though there are some very successful examples, including donation of 1 million tons of wheat, but it's the kind of development expenditure that we did, including infrastructure investments in roads such as the Ranch-Delaram road, the dam, the Salma Dam, and also the Pule Khumri Kabul, the transmission line. But most of all, I think it was our kind of, our education program, our scholarship program that created and built upon the traditional ties that we've always had, cultural ties that we've always had with Afghanistan. And, that once we have achieved that, once we have completed that and handed it over to the Afghan government, we've already got the emotional returns from that. So India has good political capital in Afghanistan right now. The challenge is really how are we going to maintain this in the context of a Taliban rule? And I think there are several ways in which that can be done. I think India could continue its scholarship program in India. India could continue to keep its doors open for Afghan medical students. India could continue to keep its door open for, artists, musicians, all the kind of cultural resources that Afghanistan has, which are likely to be driven away by extremist radical Islam in Afghanistan. And beyond that, India could also provide, room for the Islamic Republic, so to say, the modern Afghanistan, to actually continue to function outside Afghanistan. So there are many ways in which it could be done. But of course, key to that is keeping India open. And at this moment of time, the kind of rather closed visa strategy that we have is possibly the single thing that could undo that political capital that we already have. And on this whole point that I think Professor Adlakha sort of enlightened us on, the commentary in the Chinese media on how India is working against, India is not supporting CPEC for obvious reasons, but I think it's a very far stretch to say that India is actually contributing to destabilization or helping local terrorist groups to destabilize Chinese projects in Pakistan, or for that matter would do so in Afghanistan. I don't think India has that kind of reach or real intention to do it. In fact, India would, one of the few areas where China and India have seen some common interest, both in BRICS statements as well as at the Wuhan summit, even though it was a very modest and minimal effort, was on Afghanistan. And if China would like to pursue that, then of course it would need to actually distance itself a little from Pakistan's anti-India efforts in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya. And I think to give Professor Adlakha the benefit of doubt, I think he was referring to commentary that appears.
Correct. I acknowledge that.
Right. The last question to Professor Zhang, and you had suggested looking at the Taliban in a positive, in some kind of positive light, in looking at Taliban having shifted away from radicalism compared to 20 years ago. What was your view based on? Was it based on some evidence that the Taliban has really shifted away from radicalism over the last 20 years? And how does China look at the threats from radical Pakistan groups, from radical groups like the Pakistani Taliban towards CPEC? Do you think these kind of groups might create strain in China-Pakistan relations?
Okay, thank you, Chi. So, you know, my point is come from these kind of several points. The first, you see, Taliban held a lot of international dialogue with lots of countries, with US, with some countries in the Middle East, with Russia, with China, and with lots of others. It is a very different situation comparing to 20 years ago. 20 years ago, Taliban is really is very indoor, something within a room, and no interest is also no channel and contact with others. Even Taliban's, you know, why Islamic State is so eager, so strong to fight against the Taliban? The one important reason is because Taliban's talk with the US. And the Islamic State think talk with the US is some kind of betrayal of international jihad moment. I think it is very positive points when we see Taliban. Even personally, I think Taliban is far away from a really modern, really moderate international organization or governments. It's far away from international standard. But we should encourage Taliban. Not to just say, you 20 years ago, you are a bad guy. Today, we should not shake hands with you. Is the first point. The second point I also mentioned in my presentation. Today's Afghanistan is very, very different from 20 years ago. 20 years ago, Afghanistan experienced more than 20 years of war, and is invaded by former Soviet Union, and experienced and lots of years of civil war. Afghan people had no chance to reach modern world, to know what's going on in the world. But today is different. During US occupation, US and many other countries provide lots of assistance, and also provide lots of chance and channels for Afghan people, and help Afghan people understand what is modernity, what is economy, what is modern culture, and specifically in some bigger cities. I think it's very important. If Taliban really want to build a stable and strong government to develop Afghanistan, they must answer this new situation, because this new situation asks Taliban to do something better with international society. Or else Taliban will be, I think, maybe overthrown by and again maybe. And by the way, I want to add some comments relevant to former questions. You know, I want to mention that Afghanistan is not very important for China, as it is important for Russia, UK, and United States. It's because China's locality. China no need to use Afghanistan. Following retreats of US from Afghanistan, lots of issues has been changed just since retreats. You know, when US Army deployment in Afghanistan, China, Russia worried very much. We worried the US would build Afghanistan as a very strong strategic footpoint against US, against Russia. At that time, China and Russia will have a common goal to let the US away. But when US retreated, it's gone away from this strategic goal. And for Pakistan is also similar situation. When US is there, India's influence is also very strong in Afghanistan. So Pakistan worries there will be attacked from India, from two sides, not one side. So when India retreated and India's influence there is also declining, and this world is also changing. So I think it's time for China, for India, for United States. I agree with Gautam's mention. It's time for us to rethink our policy, to rethink Afghan issue. Afghan issue has been changed from a strategic issue to a non-traditional security issue. And if Afghan new governments collapsed, and Afghan people, Afghanistan, will become a new threat source for every country, not just for US or China, including other countries. So I think it's very possible for our Chinese, Americans, and Indians think again. And we should try our best to find some common points to cooperation to maintain our society. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. And let me thank our speakers once again for allowing our audience members to arrive at more informed positions on this very complex issue from where we started. Ian Johnson, Einar Tangen, Professor Hemant Adlakha, Professor Chang, Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya, thank you on behalf of the Iit Madras China Studies Center and our audience members. I'd also like to thank my team, Ramnath, Ashna, Adira, Neha, and Justin for the support and outreach that made this event possible. You would have noticed we had over 100 members who had joined our meeting throughout, and we still have about 82 of them. So that shows the amount of interest this webinar has generated. And I request all of you to please visit our website, csc.iitm.ac.in, for more information on our academic programs of study and our future events. So with that, let me wish you a very good evening. Thank you all, and please take care of your health. Thank you.
And thank you, Joe, for being an excellent moderator.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.